All right, folks, we had a really interesting interview pop up from the former chairman of Worldwide Studios and the former president and CEO of Sony Interactive Entertainment America, Shawn Layden. I'm sure you all know at this point, ever since Shawn left SIE, he's been doing a lot of panels and talks, interviews left and right. He's always making headlines somewhere from something he said. In this case, he recently did an interview with the YouTube channel KIWI Talks, speaking with Reese over there. Reese does a lot of interviews with those in the games business, and so he actually went out of his way to say, I want to ask you things that you don't normally get to talk about or touch on or reflect on nearly as often. So this was a very good, lengthy talk. I encourage you all to watch the whole thing. We won't cover everything that was in there, but we will cherry pick some of the things that are some highlights and definitely are making some headlines as of right now. So we'll dive right in with one of the first things he was asked: why did Sony use a sequential numbering system for their home consoles? Which Shawn just said point blank, it was more of a Sony Electronics thing. It seemed like a natural step to make it an easy way to define the new platform cycle, and it was also Ken Kuragi's final say on that and many other decisions, which made it really easy for stuff like that to kind of just move right past that, basically. Which he does also talk about how they made more lateral moves with the PSP to Vita or the PSP Go, but home consoles, it was definitely more of a natural naming scheme. Moving on to the PSN hack, we rarely get this kind of talk as far as like what was going on behind the scenes. And so Shawn was like, yeah, everybody was doing 18-hour days. It became the number one thing. So at that point, nothing else mattered in 2011 when the hack actually took place. So that was the one thing they needed to solve, and everything else was basically secondary. He also said it was a defining moment for a lot of people at the company because it was a sort of factor where you could see the kind of people that were willing to jump into the breach and make sure they can, get this thing done and resolved. They didn't talk about it too much, but man, I really wish we would get a little bit more as far as like what the environment was like back then in 2011. But going into some marketing insight for the original PlayStation. So he talked about how the company was initially half Sony Electronics, half Sony Music. That's well documented. So a lot of the publishing and marketing side, he talks about how they were similar in that they wanted to treat the games in the studios like they were celebrities, so big songs, rock bands, things like that. So he cites things like Wipeout with those commercials where it was blending gameplay and music in a lot of ways that games had not really done before, and that's why you were seeing PlayStation kiosks and nightclubs and things like that. He also touched on David Lynch's Welcome to the Third Space ads, RIP David Lynch, because that was a more recent thing as well. But it is true. I mean, you can look back and certainly see how the marketing cycle was with the original PlayStation, how they treated some of those games and studios, which more on the Japanese side, that was also a big thing too, where a lot of Japanese studios, or publishers, I should say, they really wanted to not spend too much time talking about producers, directors, or the studio name, things like that. But going into PC releases, so Shawn says that there were a lot of people that had the idea at the time to eventually do PC, but this was something where it was under his watch where they decided they were going to do PC games. There was a lot of pushback. He reflects back on the original PlayStation with Jetmoto and the original Warhawk, I should say. So, back then those studios did want to do PC versions. Kuragi instead decided they would not go into the PC business, which for context, Jetmoto did get a PC version, and that was only due to like a spin-off division that the company handled back then. Warhawk's PC version never actually ended up happening, but it's just something the company has always thought about and we're looking into. But going into the more recent PC stuff, Shawn said that the original vision for PC releases under his watch was not to make money, but to show the PC audience that this is what we're building, this is what we're doing, and trying to create FOMO, which is kind of a recurring factor that Shawn touches on during this interview, and certainly for more of the marketing side of things, which is generating FOMO so the audience gets to see what they're missing out on and thus buy your products. And so, especially since these games have already had, they've already sold what they have done on console after a year, 2 years down the road, there's no sales cannibalization. So that's the key factor he wanted to point out as far as why they eventually decided to do PC games, which it's also really important to, I guess, understand the context of now it's to the point where it's been 2019, that's when Shawn left the company, so things are changing in such a manner where more often during these interviews he's now saying, well, I don't know about this thing, I don't know about what they're doing nowadays. And so it's important to remember that context of that was the decision making back then. They're obviously still doing PC releases nowadays, But it would be fascinating to know if that's still their line of thinking or if maybe things are changing as far as PC releases go. But moving on to rising cost in game dev. So he gave a very straightforward answer here. It's just labor and time, unless it's a game that is using an IP from somewhere, which then gets into licensing. It's just bigger games that need more people on a longer dev cycle. It's all labor costs. And because the West Coast in North America has a lot of talent, that's why so many studios are located there. It's just very expensive labor. You can't necessarily go in the middle of nowhere, set up a studio, because at that point, how are you going to recruit talent for that studio? So I think that one was kind of pretty well known, but for those that are always curious about why games just cost so much to make nowadays, it's really just labor, and geography really does play a very big role there. Getting into the live service and Concord stuff, how does a disaster like that happen? So he says the charitable way to put it is that everybody is still learning this in real time, with the question being, how many live service games can be successful at any one moment? The answer is obviously not 20, so you have to compel people to leave the games that they're playing. And that very much is something I think a lot of publishers are learning the hard way nowadays, especially for Sony in this case, where they're a little bit late to the party, so to speak, because you've already got these 5 to 10 black hole games that are just absorbing and consuming so many people's time. So he does give a very straightforward answer there. They also touched on PlayStation AllStars, which I love. Initially, Reese was just asking, will we ever see this timeline where Sony maybe lets a PlayStation character go into Smash? Shawn says that's likely a non-starter, but never say never. But just getting into the PS All-Stars thing, Shawn thinks the game probably came to the market at the wrong time as far as like why it did not really take off. So, we're talking late life cycle PS3. There was a very big emphasis even back then of big AAA cinematic experiences. Games really were becoming something entirely different during that cycle, and more so during the latter half of that cycle. So I would agree with Shawn there. Now, going into Xbox's multi-platform strategy, how does Shawn feel about that? He says it is a valid approach. You're reaching a larger addressable market. They can't use FOMO anymore as a tactic to encourage hardware sales. So he does bring up Sega as an example of historical precedence, which is they were able to navigate it and they're doing quite well. They're very successful, but they are fully transitioned into a software company. So he kind of doesn't say a whole lot there outside of like, yeah, it's valid, but the writing might be on the wall there. Historical precedence. Now, one really good question here is, what games did you think would be big hits but were not? And so Shawn said a lot of the experimental hardware they did in London, so things like the SingStar mics for the karaoke experience, or the iToy, the PSI, camera games like iPet, he said they were successful, but they pretty much mellowed out after that and folks got tired of it. So it didn't really have the long-term success they were hoping for. Now, the really big thing that is likely the title and thumbnail for the video, but he also touched on physical video games, if Sony will make PS6 digital only. So Shawn thinks that Sony could not get away with that. The reason being that Sony is the #1 platform in about 170 countries. So they have an obligation to consider that if they go discless, how many of those people cannot make the jump to a fully discless console? He also gave more specific examples here where celebrities like to take their consoles to hotels when they're traveling, or how PlayStation consoles are really popular on military bases. So that is a really problematic area as far as reliable internet goes. So he thinks it would be really hard for them to go discless in the next generation. My thought on this has not really changed too much, because I still feel that PlayStation 6 will offer disc playability in some way. The only sort of doubt that is slightly creeping in my mind with the most recent conversation we had as far as the sales ratio goes for like base consoles, where initially in 2020 it was like 80-20. Sony was primarily selling disc consoles. Now it's starting to favor more of a 50-50 split, where they're selling a lot of digital consoles as well, with PS5 Pro as a low volume machine also only offering the digital version without, you'd have to buy the disc drive separately. But considering all those factors, the only thing I'm wondering is, will PlayStation 6 have PS6 printed games? I still find the obligation that would be a very tough sell going into, say, PlayStation 6, is that, if it's digital only, that is a really tough thing to sell when you have a large market of consumers with PS4 and 5 discs. So at that point, there is more mounting pressure as every generation goes on of making sure that you can accept disc playback for those prior two console cycles, especially thinking that PS6 is going to be a machine that will play PS6, 5, and 4 games. So there is, I would think the obligation is much larger simply to make sure you can play the 4 and 5 games. But I'm just wondering, will we have PS6 printed media? And that extends to publishers as well. Let's say Sony allows it, but how many publishers are going to really care to print their games on PlayStation 6? Because it also lives and dies from their point of view. We are right in the middle of a circumstance where a lot of publishers are choosing to either skip the disc or it doesn't come out till much later. They're not printing all the content on the disc, which is problematic because at that point, the internet requirement is going to be an issue for examples even Shawn's proposing here, right? Where it's 170 plus countries, making sure you can address all those customers, even the more specific examples of military bases or a celebrity traveling with their console, right? Like if a disc still requires internet, that is still a problem. So I'm still concerned, but I still always felt like, yes, PlayStation 6 is going to play discs in some way, shape, or form, and I really think it's more a matter of, at the very minimum, making sure it can accept 4 and 5 discs. But yeah, it was a really good talk. I highly encourage you all to watch the rest of it, and we also have a new talk with Shuhei Yoshida, who's been also just an open book ever since he left Sony as well, and he's got more things that he's saying over on MinMax as well, so we'll probably talk about that relatively soon. But yeah, hope you all enjoyed this conversation. It was really fun to hear Shawn talk about these things. It was a great interview from Reese over there on KIWI Talks, and that is pretty much it. We'll see you on this coming Friday for LTPS. We also have the Click R3 coming out very soon as well, so I will see you all then. But that is pretty much it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.